Kia ora koutou. I'm Finlay MacDonald. The coming famine. In fact, I have to say, it's lovely to see so many people here tonight for a session entitled The Coming Famine. If we'd just called it The End is Nigh, we'd have doubled the numbers, wouldn't we? So that's the title of the book written by my guest tonight, who I'll get to quite shortly. Over the course of our discussion, we'll look in turn at each of the challenges facing our ability to feed and sustain ourselves as the planet's human population heads towards a peak predicted to happen early in the second half of this century. As demand grows correspondingly and developing economies change their consumption habits, so the argument goes, shortage of supply will become a crisis if something isn't done. One thing there is no shortage of, however, is the evidence to show that this population and demand peak is rapidly approaching. Water, arable land, oil and its associated byproducts, fisheries and materials for fertiliser, all of them are heading for peak demand and production capacity. Add into that the complex situation, the forces of climate change and mass urbanisation, and the challenge is readily apparent. In short, how do you double global food production with diminishing resources and without increasing environmental instability? It sounds daunting, and it is daunting, but someone who's tried to answer this question and who does retain some room in his mind for optimism is with me on stage. Would you please welcome journalist, science writer and author of The Coming Famine, Julian Cribb. As we go along, we'll be putting some slides up behind us that just kind of background the various aspects of this very large topic. They're just a helpful guide to the basic information, and bear with us if we have to flick back and forth occasionally to find the right slide. But that's Julian's problem, not mine. I thought we'd begin, before we got into the specifics though, with just a kind of very general introductory discussion, beginning with how you first engaged with this subject. Was there an epiphany of sorts, or did it just gradually...
A very slow burning one, actually. Yeah, I was an agricultural journalist for about 40 years, a science journalist. And as I sort of travelled the world, including to places like New Zealand and things like that, I saw more and more issues were arising in agriculture and food production. And I realised about 10 years ago that I had the pieces of a rather large and important jigsaw puzzle in my bag. And I guess that's what journalists do, isn't it? They collect little bits of information from experts, from scientists and farmers and people like that, and they build a picture. And I realised with a chill that the picture looked fairly grim. A lot of people were assuming that we were going to be right, you know, that there was plenty of food. Look in the shops, there's lots of food. We've all had a good meal tonight. But there are warning signs. For the last 10 years, we've been producing less food than is needed to meet the growing demand.
Already?
Already. The last 10 years, really.
Did the lack of general knowledge and discussion about such a vast topic surprise you at the time? Or did you think I must be wrong, surely?
Not really, because, you know, agriculture has become one of those non-vogue topics, you know. We assume it's there, it'll produce our food for us. We take it for granted. It frustrates the hell out of farmers. But society, you know, as long as the shops are stocked and things like that, it goes its merry way, especially in these blessed countries, you know, New Zealand, Australia, America. We've got no shortages. Well, why should we worry about something like that? The Green Revolution's fixed it, hasn't it?
That's quite the opposite. I mean, that's the paradox I guess you're grappling with. We've got an abundance, or seemingly an abundance. So we're blind to the problem, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Have you encountered skeptics in the way that climate change science has encountered people that say that you're simply shroud waving?
I get accused of being a neo-Malthusian and things like that occasionally. I don't mind being accused of being... I mean, Malthus merely said that human population tends to outrun the food supply. And that's a reasonably acute observation, but it also belongs to the 18th century or something. So, I mean, times have changed a fair bit. I just think that there is a great degree of complacency in our governments and in our particularly prosperous urban societies about this issue. People do not realise how close to the wall we might be.
Let's look at what we know then, and this might require fiddling with that little remote control. Population and demand. We've got surging demand there. Take us through the forecasted increase in population and food demand this century, as far as anyone can tell.
Well, the United Nations, everybody knows, says 9.2 billion people, give or take, by the 2050s. What they haven't been telling you is it's probably more like 10 to 11 to 11.5 billion by the mid-2060s. So the population graph is still going up. Not as fast as it used to go up, but it is still climbing. And it's not just people having babies, it's people living longer lives. So there are those two drivers in there. And at the same time, you've got the phenomenon of large populations in China, India, Brazil, and elsewhere, achieving a standard of living, incomes that enable them to afford protein food. So they're demanding food. They're now demanding, meat that involves, many tons of grain to produce that livestock product. So they're putting pressure on the world market. So you've got these two factors of surging population and surging demand for food that are interacting together.
Let's talk about these megacities that are already developing around us. We know this. What can we expect in terms of the statistics to do with this concentration of population in urban areas?
Well, we're seeing cities arising that are predicted by demographers to be as large as 20, 30, and even 40 million people by the mid-century.
We're almost there with some of them, aren't we?
We're pretty close. I think 20-something is, there's a city in China, I forget its name. But Jakarta, for example, is forecast to reach 37 million. I think in Manila is going to be 36 million, and so on. And these are phenomenal conurbations, very, very densely packed. And the thing that's different between these cities and the old cities is that these cities produce practically none of their own food. Right? They are totally reliant on this river of trucks that comes every night to restock the shops. And if that river breaks down, if there's a fuel crisis or a local war or something like that, what is that city going to be eating a week later? I think we've created death traps in these large cities unless we start doing something about it now. So the issue of urbanisation is important in two ways. It's important to concentrate human population in cities so that they don't take up all our farms. But at the same time, I think it's important to restart food production in cities. And we come to that. Yeah.
Let's talk about waste. A visual. Oh, there it is. So we're heading for oblivion and crisis, but getting fat in the meantime.
We are.
And throwing enough away to feed several other families.
Well, I know what my grandma would say about this, She'd be pretty uncomplimentary about it. We have lost one of the fundamental survival skills that has looked after the human race for hundreds of thousands, millions of years even, and that is thrift. Just, looking after your food supply. We trash, as I say, 30 to 50% of our food in the Western world now. In the developing world, they lose that much post-harvest because they haven't got the chillers and the transport chains and things like that. So half the efforts of the world's farmers are going to waste. Half the efforts of the agricultural scientists are going to waste. And this is a problem that can be dealt with. It's not insoluble. But we're not doing an awful lot about it at the moment.
Of course, burning fewer fossil fuels, if oil becomes prohibitively expensive, will have some impact on climate change. But let's not get too bogged down in the intricacies of the climate change debate. But it seems to me in the context of what we're talking about, whether it's anthropogenic or not, the point is more drought is bad news, more climate change is bad news in terms of the future food production.
Whatever is driving it at the moment is bad news for farmers because it means that the agricultural system that we have relied on for a long time to produce food is becoming much less predictable. It's much harder to figure out what you're going to plant, what you're going to grow, what you're going to farm now than it was 10, 20 years ago. Essentially, the way one scientist put it, which I rather like, he said that the climate that actually gave birth to agriculture over the last 5,000 or 6,000 years is becoming extinct. The climate that we're used to is going to disappear, and it's going to be replaced by another kind of climate, a rather dicier kind of climate. And so when you get these droughts, as I say, they're transmitted straight through the grain prices and things like that to the consumer. Absolutely.
What can a little country like this, albeit a bit of a breadbasket in some ways, or our big neighbour Australia dealing with its own issues. What can we contribute? You've mentioned food technology and knowledge.
Well, both of us are masters at handling tricky environments. Okay, we're masters at very high quality and high volume production. And we're pretty sustainable in world terms compared to other people's agricultural systems. Because we've made this big investment over the last 30 or 40 years in agricultural science and technology. So we've got the technology and the knowledge base in our farmers to make a big difference to a lot of other countries that need that. But we're not getting out there and sharing that knowledge as I believe we need to do. I mean, it's obvious to people that we need to share knowledge about green energy. Well, I'm saying we now need to share knowledge about agriculture. Because, you know, the knowledge that gave birth to the Green Revolution in the 60s and 70s, that's run down. The world is investing the same amount of money today in agricultural science as it was investing when there was only 3 billion human beings.
Let's go back to the problem of Western wastefulness, I guess you could say.
Yep.
Recycling, I guess, is one broad heading that we could talk about. What does it actually mean in practical terms? How could we stop wasting and use waste?
Well, when I think of a big city like Auckland, you know, there is all the food or the nutrients that are going to the tip, and that includes garden clippings and things like that. They could be you know, harvested and, you know, as I say, turned back into nutrients and soil and things like that. The same with the sewage waste. So we could recapture both water and nutrients, and we can put them back into different kinds of food production. We can put it into classical agriculture, we can put it into peri-urban horticulture, and we can put it into a whole lot of new industries that haven't even appeared yet, such as urban hydroponics. You know, I think every factory will have a farm on its roof by the mid-century. So farms on top of city buildings, on the sides of city buildings, underneath city buildings and underneath, you know, motorways and things like that will be a phenomenon. We'll have green cities. So we are going to redesign this thing we call the city in a fundamental way. And there is a phenomenal opportunity to eat more plants. And this is one thing that we really have to do. Apart from reinventing the world's agriculture, which is why we need all that science, we need to develop this new agriculture that uses less of these inputs. We also need to change the world diet so that it has slightly less of the high energy foods, the meat and the dairy, and more vegetables. And, you know, we actually eat about 200 or 300 different vegetables in our society. There are 23,000 edible plants that we know about on planet Earth. There's 6,000 in Australia, and we eat about 5 of them. You know, this just
parents, tell your children.
so there's, I mean, we can have a much more interesting diet than we've got at the moment.
Yeah.
Vastly more varied. These things can be good for your health at the same time. We're going to, the modern diet, half of people in our society die of a diet-related disease. So
I still get the feeling, though, that this is a boutique solution to a warehouse problem. And can one replace the other, really? I mean, would farmers' markets feed Jakarta in the year 2050?
Well, that depends how Jakarta does urban agriculture.
Yeah.
As I say, I think we're probably going to see one or other of the big cities of the world fall over between now and then. And people are going to get such a terrible shock as a result of that they will then start looking at these kinds of solutions. So you know, this is how we will avoid the crisis, by actually witnessing.
Any ideas where that might happen?
Well, you've seen my tip. The Indo-Gangetic Plain is highly vulnerable. The North China Plain is extremely vulnerable because they're just about through their groundwater now, and it produces 70% of their food. So China is deeply worried. That's why they're over here, you know, prospecting for New Zealand farms and food companies, and Australian farms and food companies, and African farms, and so on.
Since you raised that, I think a lot of New Zealanders at a nationalistic level reject the idea. Others argue that there's great business sense to it. What are your feelings about that kind of interlocking of global agricultural economics?
Well, we are one people on one planet, and you can't avoid it now. They can't cut it out and take it home with them, but they can set it up so that it only feeds people in their country. You can argue that if they don't feed people in their country, then China will fall over and we will all suffer as a result of that. So, I mean, they are quite nervous. In my view, the Chinese government is the only one in the world, possibly followed by the Indian government, who's really aware of the magnitude of this issue. Because they know what a famine is like.
One thing that you wrote that might surprise people, particularly New Zealanders, is that part of the solution to all this might be to pay farmers more. I presume you don't mean rich Waikato dairy farmers in New Zealand, if there is such a thing anymore.
I do, because even rich Waikato dairy farmers need to have new technologies, and new technologies are very expensive, and they need to be able to buy fertiliser and stuff like that. And if you keep on turning the screw on the rich Waikato dairy farmers, they're going to be poor Waikato dairy farmers. And I'm hearing this from farmers every country I go to. I'm hearing it from American farmers, British farmers, Australian farmers, Chinese farmers. They're all saying the same thing. We are getting screwed by the market. And it's because of this phenomenal concentration in power of the supermarkets and the large food processing firms.
Well, and the agribusiness of seed manufacturers and the Monsantos of this world.
Both sides of the farmer. The people who are selling the farmer the input control the price of the farmer's fertiliser or oil or machinery, and the people who are buying the farmer's produce dictate the price that the farmer's going to get for it. And that price is going to be set by the cheapest seller among farmers, whether that farmer is in New Zealand or Madagascar. It doesn't matter, because it's a world market now. They can go wherever it's cheapest. And the British green bean industry got put out of business by Kenya. So you're seeing phenomena like that. Whole industries being shut down as the supermarkets shop around the world for the cheapest source of supply. And that is not going to sustain agriculture.
Should we take some questions? Has anybody been sitting there? We've given you food for thought. He punned terribly.
Hi, thanks for a very interesting talk. For those of us who aren't policymakers or farmers or scientists, if there were like a few things that we could take home and start doing right now, what would they be? Try and grow our own food? Try and recycle our food scraps through a worm bin or compost?
Absolutely.
Buy local.
All of that. Start to move your diet to a healthier diet with a higher component of fruits and vegetables in it. That means you're consuming less energy and less water and less land. And don't waste. If you can, compost it. Put pressure on the Auckland City Council to have a third bin with the organic waste in it, which is what they're doing in the UK and Holland and places now. It's easy to do. Lots of people are starting to do it. If you're interested in growing your own, there are people farming their street veggies in Sydney now. The city of Detroit, which is an industrial wasteland, is suddenly going back to urban agriculture. They've got agriculture in Manhattan. People are keeping bees in the middle of New York. So people are reinventing their food world. There's a lot that the concerned consumer or citizen can do in this space.
So thank you very much for coming once again. I'll pun badly and say we've had a lot of food for thought up here. It's just left to me to thank this knowledgeable and generous man, Julian Cribb.
Thank you very much.